Welcome back to the Code Ryan podcast. Today, Bright joins me and we're going to discuss web development, Next.js, and some other kind of related topics. But before we get to that, Bright, could you maybe just give me a overview of what kind of your tech journey looks like so far and kind of how you got in to web development, Next.js, and all that sort of thing?
Okay, so my journey in web development has more like been different phases. So I've had the excitement phase, the challenging phase, and the opportunities. But with all these phases, one thing has been constant that progress has been made, and I didn't have to transition from a totally different space. So I'm not coming from a medical space or anything like that. I actually did study statistics, computer science in college. And then I had the opportunity for a 6 month period industrial training. And then I registered for a boot camp. And back then I started and got hands-on with the basics, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And ever since then, I have been on it. During college, after college, I continued practicing. And that is the excitement phase. And during this period, I surely did face challenge. And one challenge I did face then was I didn't have a laptop. So I had to pair with my colleagues back then. And for resource, I made use of W3 schools. W3 school was my friend then. And I went through the whole HTML, CSS, JavaScript curriculum over there at W3 schools. And when I was able to get myself a laptop, I always knew where to check when I have challenges. And based on your level, you would face different challenges. And I was building personal portfolio websites to do applications, calculator applications. So my challenges were not super complex. And I always went to W3 schools because obviously I did come across stuff like that back then. And yep, ever since then, I've been in the tech space.
Gotcha. Very cool. And I definitely think that, when you're starting out, like to us right now, it probably doesn't seem like building a calculator app is all that complex. But, when you're starting out, just getting like your code editor set up and like running commands in the terminal and stuff like that could be like, what the heck is going on here? So I can totally relate to that. And so it sounds like you did kind of the boot camp first, and then you used like W3 schools as kind of a resource for when you kind of hit obstacles and stuff like that. And I'd be interested in like how you felt like the experience of a boot camp was for you, as I know that a lot of people today, when they start kind of transitioning into tech, maybe they're not from maybe a traditional computer science background or something, and they consider going either like the boot camp route, or they think about just going self-taught route, or maybe they even think about, going back to school depending on their circumstances. So what was kind of your experience with a boot camp, and, maybe what would you recommend someone today if they're considering that route?
The bootcamp was really helpful because then depends on your personality. Most people are free to learn where they have some other fellow learners around. Most people don't know how to sit and just learn on their own. And I had that big mix of both. I can learn with other people. I can learn on my own or with other learners as well. And the bootcamp was pretty much helpful to get that path, because whilst learning on your own, you have the challenge on bringing your own curriculum, knowing what to learn afterwards. And the bootcamp, I just had that experience of, okay, you go with HTML, what to learn and what not to learn, what to leave for later. And if you're self-taught, you hear a whole lot of things. You can be learning CSS and you're hearing Tailwind, and you're like, am I meant to be learning CSS or do I jump to Tailwind? And whilst learning Tailwind, you can be hearing Material UI, or you can be hearing some other SCSS, and you're like, what am I learning? And, just picking up these beats here. So Bootcamp can help provide that learning path for you, make you get used to the buzzwords, IDE, syntax, errors, stuff like that. And when you're just at your home learning on your own, you just have to get that curriculum right and just come up with your own path and tackle your challenges as you go?
I went the self-taught route, but I definitely think that if I would have gone the bootcamp route, I probably would have saved myself some time, just because when going self-taught, you do have to like almost develop a curriculum by yourself, to where you're kind of trying to sift through a ton of different, YouTube channels or courses on Udemy or Coursera or stuff like that. And it's really hard to kind of understand which path you should take. And then also when you're self-taught, it's kind of tricky because, like you said, you're starting to learn CSS, but then you hear everyone else talking about like Tailwind or Material UI or some other styling like framework or method. So sometimes you find yourself jumping from one technology to the next, and you don't really know at that point, like, what are the kind of core fundamentals to focus on, like, basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Like, you kind of bounce around a lot more. So I definitely think that those boot camps do have that benefit. The downside is most boot camps, especially in-person ones, they cost money. So that is one of the downsides, but it does kind of give you that path. And hey, if you're able to get a, decently paying web development job a few months sooner, you're going to make all that money back on that you spent on that boot camp ahead of time. So yeah, definitely pros and cons of each route there.
Sure.
And then how did you kind of transition into the kind of Next.js side of things? So it sounds like, you did the boot camp, you started building maybe your own projects, it sounds like, and using like W3 Schools as a resource. And then maybe before we get into Next.js, how did you go about like applying for jobs and studying for like technical interviews? So in kind of my head right now, my timeline for you is like coding bootcamp, started building your own projects, and then maybe you got kind of like your portfolio together and started applying, or kind of what did that part look like when it came to like, applying for jobs and stuff like that?
Yeah. So after the bootcamps, the challenge continued, and I started hearing to move forward, to do bigger projects, you need to learn a framework. You're not going to get a job with just HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Top companies don't make use of those. And, I was like, okay, so what do I learn next? And I'm making my research. Okay, I have to learn a framework. And I hear Angular has much more structure than React or Vue. And I'm thinking, okay, so maybe when I learn Angular, I can, start applying for jobs. But Angular ecosystem was too large for a complete beginner, because Angular uses TypeScript. Angular uses observables. You hear Next.js. You have TypeScript classes, object-oriented programming. Their own HTTP module. It was a whole lot for a complete beginner. I struggled a whole lot. I never felt welcomed. I never felt welcomed, but successfully, I actually did build out my own personal portfolio with Angular, and I just had to transition into React. And then I left Angular, and for the whole overhead stuff to learn, I went over to React, and I actually did feel at home with React, because then I saw my normal functions. I wasn't forced to use TypeScript. And I just knew if I should return something that looks like HTML, which is JSX, I would have something on the screen. So I knew I could have my inline styling in my divs or HTML elements, rather than have, you could do that in Angular, but rather than have your separate files for styling, separate your services, a whole lot. So for a complete beginner, I felt at home. But because of the little experience I had with with Angular, I just knew some best practices in React. Actually, I just knew I had to separate. I don't have to write everything in the file. I had to separate and build out my UI of little, what is it called?
Components?
Composition. Yeah, components. Yep. And yep, from there, I worked with Angular and with React, and then I started applying for jobs, and my first job I got was actually Angular. So so I was back to to what I was running away from. Yeah. So then I worked and I struggled on the job, definitely. And I was able to work, for at least close to a year. And then I felt comfortable with Angular, still doing my React on the side. Yep. And then more opportunities came gradually, and that's how I just focused more on React.js.
Gotcha. So you kind of went away from Angular, then were forced right back into it. And that is kind of what happens sometimes when you transition, to a job. And especially like, sounds like that was your first job. So, I know for me, when getting my first job, it's like, beggars can't be choosers. I'm not going to, really argue too much and really get too specific with it. It's just somebody give me a job is kind of was my thought process. And kind of with that kind of journey there, how well do you think that you knew like JavaScript before transitioning to one of those frameworks? And like, would you recommend kind of someone still starting out, should they really study JavaScript for a long time before moving into these frameworks? As I know there's kind of differing opinions on this, to where some people say you should just learn like the basics of JavaScript and then move to a framework kind of as soon as you can, as most jobs are probably going to be using some sort of framework. But then other people have the opinion that you should learn like the ins and outs of JavaScript and really focus on it, really study it. And then from there, move to a framework, but only after you've learned like really some of the quirks of JavaScript and some of the kind of weird parts of JavaScript. So where do you kind of lie on that? Do you think that they should study it for a really long time and really learn some of those kind of details, or once they learn the basics, then go and move on from there?
Yep, it's important as a software engineer. If you're looking to get a job, or if you're looking to build your own, if you have your own project in mind, if you're trying to spend so much time in the software industry, I would advise you try to master JavaScript, because the frameworks will always change. The frameworks, the libraries will always change, but the core JavaScript, even though, it grows ES6 and all of that. But, once you're familiar with the JavaScript, you can transition even to other programming languages and to other frameworks easily, and you'll definitely not be caught off guard. Rather than getting started straight up with a framework, it's definitely going to be super, super challenging. So mastering the basics of JavaScript. In my case, I got comfortable with React because I knew functions, I knew async and await, I knew how to interact with the DOM. And in React.js, those are the things you would usually do: fetch data, display data on the screen, your UI, and it's important that you master the basics and not waste too much time on it, actually. So it's not like, because learning never ends, and you don't want to spend 2 years learning JavaScript because you want to become a React developer. But once you're comfortable, I always have this trick of doing a project. You can just do a super to-do application where you have the CRUD functionalities. And once you're done with that, you can try to add a server or a database in the mix. And with that, you can now go back to React.js.
And I totally agree. And I also think that there's a balance there, to where, like you said, you don't want to spend multiple years just focusing on every single little detail of JavaScript, as that's just going to take you a really long time to get a job. And like, if you're capable enough to build your own projects with, JavaScript and React, I think that you're capable to get a job. And then from there, once you get that first job, you'll continue learning and learn maybe some of those kind of details that come up with issues that you'll run into. But I think that learning, like really having a good understanding of JavaScript, so making sure that some of those kind of more complex parts of, async await and promises and set timeouts and some things about the JavaScript runtime. But then don't spend a crazy amount of time there, and make sure you kind of do move on to learning some sort of framework. And that's another question I was going to ask you as well, is do you recommend that someone learns a framework before they start applying to jobs? Or do you think that someone could start applying after they know like the fundamentals of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and can like build their own projects with that? Or would you recommend them knowing a framework before they kind of move on to applying to jobs?
As always in life, there's no clear path. And if you're able to get hands on with the basics, I've seen companies that just need a UI person, where they have someone to build the UI and they give it to their senior engineers to work with. So you can be lucky and get roles like that where you focus more on the CSS and HTML, just writing that, and then the developers inbuilt in the company can use it to build softwares. And it also gives you the experience. And yep, so it depends on the kind of job. But if you obviously you can be going for a more senior role with just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, because then you would be in charge of you own a specific domain of the project, and which hovers around a kind of framework. So yep, you can be lucky. You can be lucky, and then you get the role, maybe just CSS, HTML. Yep, super helpful. But then for owning your own domain and growing in the tech field, you can now go on to add a framework to the mix.
Yeah, and I would definitely say that you're going to have more opportunities for jobs if you do know a framework, and you're probably going to make yourself a much more appealing candidate if you know a certain framework, as well as I haven't looked for jobs recently, but I know when I was applying to my current job a handful of years ago, most job descriptions, even at that time, suggested, at least some sort of knowledge of one of the frameworks, either, React, Vue, Angular, Svelte, something like that. So I think that's really good advice. And, when kind of thinking about that side of things, would you recommend that someone takes that a step further as well, and that they learn something like I think called like a meta framework these days, Next.js? Or do you think that if someone just learns React, that's kind of good enough to kind of get their foot in the door and kind of get that first job, and then maybe on the side learn Next.js? Or where do you see kind of Next.js fitting in this picture of someone trying to just have the best chances of getting that kind of first job?
Next.js first comes with its own advantages, and top companies use Next.js for a reason. Yep, because most recently, or most notably, server-side rendering of your application, SEO, and performance. And with React, you have to do a whole lot of configuration if you're to server-side render your React application. I think most recently it's been included in the current versions of React. But back then with Next.js, you have that your resume, you go on to improve your resume if you know Next.js, and you obviously increase your chances of getting a role, because a server-side rendered application these days comes with a whole lot of advantages. Yep, so it's super helpful, and if you can pick up Next.js knowledge, I would definitely advise you go on to pick it up, even for your own personal projects, organization. You might want to consider using a server-side rendered framework.
Yeah, and I feel similarly along those lines, to where I think that you can probably get that first job with learning HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and then some sort of framework. But if it's not before you get that first job, at some point, I would definitely learn about, server-side rendering and some of the benefits to some of these full stack frameworks. And, that kind of leads me to another question. When you were first kind of applying to jobs, did you focus on full stack frameworks and full stack as well? Or did you specifically look for like more of a front end engineering job? As I know that's what I did. I just kind of focused on the front end, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and React. And then from there, I was able to get my first job and really didn't have much kind of back end knowledge when I was first getting that job. But what was kind of your approach to that? Did you also learn full stack, or were you kind of mostly front end focused there?
I did learn full stack, but professionally, I haven't had been focused more on the back end side of code. I focus more on the front end. And picking up the full stack knowledge came even when I had a role. Yep. And then I learned Node.js full stack to improve my resume and to also build personal projects, because then you have to you need to have some server-side code. Yeah. And I did learn Firebase as well, which was more like a backend as a service during my Angular years. So then I was already having some kind of experience by having your backend decoupled with your front end. And yep, I picked up Node.js server-side programming, even when I have gotten a front-end role. So yep, and during the application process, I was more focused on the front end because that was what I knew at that point. Yep, and then I started learning the back end side of things on my own.
Yeah, and I think that when someone's first applying for a job, just kind of focusing on mostly front end is probably a decent approach, because you don't necessarily have to get or worry about studying kind of database stuff and kind of gaining that knowledge alongside all the front end stuff. That can be a little bit daunting when you're getting into your first job. But then again, it depends on kind of where someone's interest lies. Like for me personally, I've just always enjoyed working on the front end more. So that's kind of what I've gravitated to. So I think that, if someone likes that, they could just mostly focus on the front end and get that first job. But I would also say that in pretty much any application, there's going to be some sort of back-end component. So if someone wants to improve their resume, improve their skills as an overall software engineer and developer, at some point, learning the back-end, or at least learning like a back-end as a service. I've also used Firebase, and I've built projects with Supabase as well. And those are kind of similar backends as a service there. So both of those are good options as well for a front-end developer that just wants to kind of dip their toe into backend without necessarily building out a database from scratch or something like that. So
if you get a job, you'll most likely be focused on one thing at a time. So yep, even with the full stack experience, back end, front end experience, you would have a specific role to focus on.
Yep, absolutely. And maybe just a couple of questions here to wrap up. So when you're creating, like, I know you have done several projects on your YouTube channel, Coding with Lari, and with that, what's your process for kind of starting a project from scratch? Like, if you have this idea for a project in your head, do you like first design your UI and your pages in like Figma or something like that? I know me personally, I tend to just like dive into the code and figure things out as I go. But what's kind of your approach like when you're starting a brand new project from scratch? Like, how do you kind of approach that?
The process did improve over time. So it's more like two phases, because starting off for young content creators, it can be quite expensive if you're thinking so much about the gears, getting a microphone, a monitor, a camera, good lighting. All of those can be super expensive to put together. So I did, when my first video back then was just without any second monitor, without any UI. I just went straight up into development and OBS for screen recording and no audio. And I used my phone later on, the recording, to add the audio, and then mixed everything in together. So that was my process the early days, and the process has grown over time. So now I write the code before. I don't go super into Figma design. I check around for free community stuff on Figma, and I see the design. I already have the idea in mind, so I know what I'm searching, and with that I can just make use of the design or have the idea on how to lay things out, and then I write the code ahead of time. Not super the whole project, because building that project, there are so many moving parts. So if it's really a full stack project and you want to build the whole full stack project before screen recording, you would find out that a page can just have one function or one component, and which is calling another component. So I usually go feature by feature. And when I implement a feature, then I just go on to teach that feature with recording my screen, and I just go on from there. So building ahead of time is easier for me. I can just spend a day recording if I have the code. All done already.
If someone's listening to this and they're thinking about building a project for like their own portfolio, would you say that it's a good idea to do like some design on the front end with, like before they even dive into the project to, mock up some designs or something? Or do you think that, for someone just building a project from scratch, they're kind of good to just, dive in, start figuring things out as they go and just kind of hop right into the code? Because I know me personally, that's kind of my approach. Sometimes I wish I would think things out a little bit more before I kind of just dive into things. But what would you recommend for someone just building their own kind of personal project?
For me, I try to plan ahead. Yeah, I try to plan the technology stack. And there's usually a clash between what I want to learn and what I want to teach. So sometimes I have an idea of what I want to learn, because most of the time I want to learn something new and I want to teach. So I'm like checking, are people interested to learn what I'm willing to learn as well? And if there's a market for it, I try to record firsthand. First, I have the project in mind. I plan out the tech stack, and I say, okay, people are talking so much about shared CI and UI. Perhaps I should introduce it in the project. And okay, then I introduce it in the project, and I know that, okay, people be willing to learn it. And then I have the functionalities. I plan out the functionalities. And with that, I start coding first. So I code after I have the plan, and then I use my second screen.
Perfect. And, that makes a lot of sense to me. I wish I would plan things out a little bit more kind of ahead of time. But it's just kind of how I am at this point. But maybe as just one kind of last question here. So you mentioned that sometimes there's a conflict between like the project or the tech stack that, is going to like work well versus kind of what you just personally want to learn. So in 2024, is there any particular technologies that you just personally want to learn or that you think are cool or that people should kind of keep their eye out for?
Currently, what I'm looking to learn, I'm looking to do more of the mobile application developments 2024. So I was picky. Is it React Native? Is it Flutter? I decided to go with Flutter and gradually introducing it to the community. And apart from mobile application, I'm trying to not learn too much, rather improve our knowledge that is there already. Software architecture, I'm looking to improve more on the software architectural side of things. Try to just improve on previous knowledge and just mobile application development.
Gotcha. And I think that, for me anyways, my kind of process of learning things has kind of been, front-end development first, and then kind of learning back-end development. And now in my current job, I'm getting more and more into like the architecture side of things, as well as like developer operations and stuff. So it kind of sounds like maybe you're on a similar path there to where you kind of have the full stack stuff down pretty well, but now you kind of want to move into mobile architecture stuff, as well as maybe developer operations and stuff like that. So it sounds like we're kind of in a similar spot there, which is cool to hear. But kind of with that, Bright, is there, where can people kind of go find you? I mentioned your YouTube channel earlier. So if people want, are like, this guy definitely knows what he's talking about, where should they go to kind of find your stuff?
My YouTube channel, LinkedIn, I'm over there on LinkedIn, or you could just write me a mail. I'm not super into Instagram or Twitter, so more LinkedIn, and maybe write me a mail.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for having me.